In our last video, we talked about the importance of the heart valves. And you'll recall that the heart valves are what separate the atria and the ventricles, and they also separate the ventricles from the major arteries that leave the heart. So I want a quick look at an animation here to help us kind of just put these things into perspective. So here's an animation that kind of puts all the pieces together. So we have blood flowing in a one-way direction through the heart. So if we follow these blood cells here that are coming in, this is the superior vena cava, this is the inferior vena cava, blood is flowing into the atria. So this is the right atrium, superior and inferior vena cava, bringing blood to the heart. That passively flows through the open AV valve into the left ventricle. Into the right ventricle. On this side of the heart, we look at the left ventricle, the same thing is happening. Simultaneously, we have blood coming into the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. So blood is flowing from the lungs to the left atrium into the left ventricle passively through open valves. So these are the AV valves. We have the right AV valve, which is sometimes called the tricuspid valve. And we have the left AV valve, which is sometimes called the mitral valve. So blood flows passively through these valves. So let's watch it kind of step by step. We can see the blood cells coming in. We can see it's filling the ventricle. It continues to fill the ventricle until the atria are stimulated to contract. And if we watch that again, I'm just going to back it up here. So it continues to flow. And then the atria, we can see their atria are contracting. They're stimulated to contract by an electrical impulse, which we call depolarization, as the ion flow across the membrane of these muscle cells changes, creating an action potential leading to contraction. So we can see the atria contract, and they fill the last part of the ventricle, the last 20%. And just as these ventricles start to contract, that rising pressure slams these AV valves shut, and we hear our first heart sound, which is the lub. So if I go forward one little bit, if I look here, I can see that first heart sound occurred, the S1, as these AV valves were shut at the beginning of heart contraction, which we call systole. So there's a brief period of time when all the valves are shut to the ventricle, and we call that isovolumetric contraction, because the muscle of the heart, the two ventricles are contracting, but the volume isn't changing because there's no blood entering or leaving the heart yet, because all the valves are closed. So when the heart is a completely closed chamber, at the very beginning of contraction, we call that isovolumetric. We're going to see another stage of that when the heart is relaxing, but right now this is the contraction phase, and that's when we hear these valves shutting, these right and left AV valves shut, giving that lub sound. So as the pressure continues to rise, as these ventricles contract, we see blood leaving the heart now through the open valves in the arteries that carry blood away from the ventricles. We have the pulmonary artery that opens up here, and the aortic valve that opens here. Notice these are happening simultaneously. So blood leaves the ventricles and heads off to their different directions. Now from the right ventricle, it's going to head to the lungs to pick up oxygen. From the left ventricle, it's going to head to the body, out the aorta, to serve the body with all this freshly oxygenated blood that had just come back from the lungs. So then that's going to continue until the heart starts to relax, diastole. So systole was contraction, diastole is relaxation. As the heart begins to relax, the blood is going to flow backward and shut these pulmonary and aortic valves. And that's our second heart sound. That's the dup. And we see that that follows right here, the dup. And the heart is starting to relax at this point. We can see as it relaxes, those AV valves open up, and we're ready for another cycle of contraction. So we have rapid ventricular filling, followed by atrial contraction and finishing up of the filling, and then the ejection of the heart through the pulmonary and aortic valves as blood flows away from the heart. But again, because of these valves, you're going to notice there's only a one-way direction. They flow in through the veins, to the ventricles, and out through the arteries. So in through the veins, out through the ventricles, through the arteries. So it's always veins, atria, ventricles, arteries. It's always in that one-way direction. And the valves, the closing of the valves, is what ensures that blood doesn't flow back into the chamber that it came from. So we'll see in this animation that blood never flows back into the atria from the ventricles because those AV valves are closed. And it never flows back into the ventricles from the aorta or the pulmonary artery because those valves are closed. So it's always a one-way direction. So we'll go back to our notes. If I can find them. So the heart is a side-by-side pump. The right side of the heart we call the pulmonary circuit, and the left side of the heart is the systemic circuit, because everything that leaves the ventricle goes to the rest of the body. So we have this aorta branching and going up to the head and then coming down to the rest of the body. So a side-by-side pump, and again, this is the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. They carry the same volume of blood, each side of the heart, but they differ in their pressures. The left side of the heart pumps blood under much higher pressure because it's pushing that blood to the rest of the body, and oftentimes the vessels are narrow. And because of that extra work, the left ventricle becomes thicker. Like any muscle that we work, it becomes thicker with time. But eventually it can't keep up with increased pressure if we have chronically high blood pressure and narrow vessels, and eventually the heart fails and it can no longer pump as much blood. As a result, extra blood stays in the heart because it can't pump it all out effectively, or at least the percentage. We shoot for about 55% of the volume to leave the heart, but if the heart starts to fail, more than 55% will stay in, and as a result, the heart starts to fail because there's leftover blood and it just can't keep up with that extra volume. So if we look at cardiac muscle, the cells that contract to make the heart do its pumping action, there's some special structures that we find. The cells are branched, for one, so the cells are a little different than skeletal muscle. They are branched, and they also have special connecting points called intercalated discs. So intercalated discs are where two different cardiac muscle cells are connected, and there's two things that we find there. We find gap junctions, which are little doorways for ions to flow between muscle cells. So it flows from the cytoplasm of one cardiac muscle cell to the cytoplasm of another. So if we have an action potential as a result of increased ion flow, for example, sodium ion, we see an action potential. We see depolarization as a result. And that causes contraction, and that's going to go from cell to cell very quickly as long as there's these passageways for those ion changes to flow from cell to cell. The desmosomes tether the different cells together, so if one cell contracts, the other cell goes with it. So the heart contracts as a unit because of these intercalated discs. The two things again, the desmosomes tethering those cells together, and the gap junctions allowing action potentials to flow from cell to cell very easily as the ions can flow through these passageways from cell to cell. So it behaves as a single unit because of these unique structures. So if we look at the heart muscle cells that make up the heart, 99% of them are contractile muscle cells that require an action potential to do their job. So they need to be stimulated by ion flow in a nearby cell or through some source of electrical impulse, maybe a neuron that is releasing a neurotransmitter, and that stimulates the cell to contract. But there are a small percentage of cells, 1% of the heart muscle cells are called pacemaker cells. They can contract weakly, but their main job is to initiate the action potential that will spread throughout the heart along the conduction pathway. So these cells are very much less numerous, but they are found at the SA node, the AV node, the bundle of His, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers. And each of these structures is found on this diagram here. It's the conduction pathway. So the yellow pathway is where we find these cells that can make their own action potential without any stimulation from the outside. So their cell membranes drift toward threshold and fire off an action potential, an electrical impulse, to begin contraction in the rest of the heart. So it starts at the SA node. They have different rates of action potential firing. So the faster it can do it, the more that spreads throughout the heart and takes over contraction. So the SA node is the pacemaker of the heart because it has the highest rate per minute that it can conduct an action potential or generate an action potential. So the impulse begins at the SA node, and that impulse spreads through the rest of the heart, and the atria contract. It goes to the AV node and then travels down into the interventricular septum, which is called the bundle of His, which is right here. And then these two, where it branches, are called the bundle branches. And then this impulse will run up the sides, called the Purkinje fibers. So these are all clusters of cells that can generate their own action potential and stimulate muscle contraction throughout the heart. So even though they generate the impulse in their cells, that impulse spreads through those gap junctions to the rest of the muscle cells and stimulates them to contract. So we see a very orderly fashion. The SA node fires first, then the AV node fires, then that impulse travels to the bundle of His, down the bundle branches, up the Purkinje fibers. So the ventricles contract last and the atria contract first based on how these action potentials travel down the conduction pathway. So what happens then if the SA node is damaged by cardiovascular disease? It no longer generates an action potential because these cells were damaged. Well, then the AV node will take over and the heart will beat at a slower rate at 40 to 60 beats per minute. What would happen if both of these were damaged? Well, then the ventricles would beat at an even lower rate, 30 to 40 beats per minute, because that's as fast as these cells can generate an action potential to stimulate the ventricles to contract. So the ventricles are very important for keeping blood flowing throughout our heart, and it requires a good functioning SA node to keep that heart rate at a normal rate and to allow for good contraction for filling and emptying of the heart. So an electrocardiogram really is a measurement of how this impulse is traveling across the heart. So we call this wave the PQRST wave. Those are the essential components. The P wave represents the impulse traveling, or initiating, I should say, at the SA node. We call that atrial depolarization, is when that impulse begins at the SA node with the flow of sodium out of the cell, into the cell, causing the cell to become more positive. So you learned about this back in the nervous system, but the key thing is we need the atria to be stimulated electrically through ion flow in order to contract. So if we see a P wave, we know the atria are contracting because the electrical stimulation event is indicated by this P wave. Then the QRS wave is the electrical signal for ventricular depolarization, which is going to lead to ventricular contraction. So as long as we see the ventricles contracting, we're going to see a QRS complex, and it should be tall and narrow if the ventricles are working properly. And then the T wave, this last bump, it's a little larger than the P wave. This is the electrical activity representing the ventricles relaxing, which is stimulated by ventricular repolarization. So the electrical events that are measured by these deflections or wave patterns, we have the P wave representing atrial depolarization, which will stimulate atrial contraction. The QRS is ventricular depolarization, which will stimulate ventricular contraction. And then the T wave, which indicates ventricular repolarization, which leads to ventricular relaxation. So atria contract, ventricles relax. The atria also relax, but that's hidden inside of this QRS wave, so we're not going to see that. So as long as we see the normal spacing and height of these different waves, we can assume that the heart is beating and that conduction pathway is operating correctly. So the cardiac cycle, it just refers to the events where the blood is entering the ventricles through the atria and the open AV valves. The heart contracts, closes the AV valves, opens up the pulmonary and aortic valves, and then it empties. So the cardiac cycle is just that process of moving blood through the heart, the right and left side working simultaneously. Like I said in this previous animation, this is in your Blackboard under the Extra Resources tab. This is the cardiac cycle. We have atrial systole, we have the isovolumetric contraction where all the valves are closed, we have the ejection phase, then we have isovolumetric relaxation where all the valves are closed again, and then we have rapid filling. So these are phases. You can step through this and kind of watch how the different pressures are affected and the volumes change throughout the cycle. The EKG and those heart sounds are indicated again by the closing of the valve. So remember that for the test. Heart sounds are due to the closing of the valves in the heart as blood is pushing against them. So cardiac output is a measure of how much blood is pumped by each ventricle over time. So we measure this in a minute. And looking at pumping of a heart over a minute, that's another name for heart rate. So to determine cardiac output, we have to know how much is leaving the heart each beat and what is the heart rate. So the formula for cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. And stroke volume is just how much is leaving each ventricle per beat, which is about 70 milliliters. So 70 milliliters leaves with each beat, and there is a percentage of that of total volume that it was starting with that stays in the heart. So when we measure stroke volume, we take what is the volume of blood in the heart when it's relaxed and subtract what is left in the heart after it contracted. So again, if we go back to this animation here, there's a lot of volume in the blood, a lot of volume in the ventricles at the end. So if I just kind of step through here, so the heart is full of blood at this point. So this would be my end diastolic volume. So we're at the end of the relaxation phase. So the heart is very full. So we take that volume and then we subtract what's left in the heart after contraction. So this is after contraction. The heart is not empty of blood. There's a percentage that remains in the heart, and that's called the end systolic volume. So all I do then is I subtract the two. I subtract the amount that was in the heart before it contracted minus the volume that was in the heart after it contracted. So it only pumps about 60% of its volume. We call that the ejection fraction. So anything less than 55% can be a sign of heart failure. We want that heart to beat 60% of that end diastolic volume out of the heart with each beat. If the heart can't pump strong enough and there's blood left over in the heart, that's what heart failure is all about. So the heart is really good at the heart function is really good at being monitored by different things throughout the body to make sure we are within homeostasis, and if anything is changing, we can influence heart rate to change that. So if we look at blood pressure, we have pressure receptors that are monitoring blood pressure in the atria, and we also see pressure receptors in the carotid arteries. So if pressure is going down, the heart is stimulated to beat more rapidly and with stronger force. pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. If carbon dioxide levels are increasing, oxygen is decreasing, pH is decreasing. We have chemoreceptors primarily in the medulla oblongata that are measuring the amount of these substances, and if carbon dioxide is too high or oxygen is too low or pH is too low, the heart will beat faster to try to correct the issues. Extracellular ion concentration. If we have too much potassium in the blood, that's going to slow the heart rate because that causes repolarization, relaxation of the heart, and that's going to slow the heart rate. Body temperature. We know that when we're hot, our heart rate will increase. If you've ever noticed when you've had a fever, your heart rate increased. When we're very cold, heart rate goes down because the needs of the body are less. We don't need to deliver as much oxygen to the tissues. So when animals are hibernating, the body temperature goes down and their heart rate decreases. So when you look at the heart, it does have nervous system connections. So we have these baroreceptors, we have chemoreceptors found throughout the body. I mentioned a couple, but we have just the nervous system is working very intimately with the heart to make sure it's maintaining homeostasis. So from the medulla, we have sympathetic nervous system fibers going to the SA node and to the heart muscle itself to increase the force of contraction and increase the rate of contraction in a fight or flight situation. The parasympathetic nervous system, remember, is a rest and digest system, so it has fibers only to the SA node to slow the heart rate when we're in a rest and digest state. We also have nerves leaving the spinal cord going to the adrenal medulla, and these are sympathetic fibers when we're in a stress, a fight or flight situation. That's going to stimulate the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine to the blood, and epinephrine acts on the heart to, again, increase the force of contraction and increase the heart rate. So as we age, what can we look forward to? Well, we see gradual changes in the heart at rest. We see a enlarging of the left ventricle as it pushes blood under more pressure out of the heart. The maximum heart rate will go down. We see a slower heart rate even during exercise. So people can't quite keep up with exercise with the people of a younger age whose heart can beat faster to meet the demands of the working muscles. So we're always going to see people become a little more tired as those heart rates get higher as we get older. And we see an increased tendency for the valves to break down and not function as well. So we start to see leaking valves, stiffening valves, and that affects blood flow in and out of the heart. So oftentimes people come in for valve replacements because of heart damage due to, valve damage, just due to being, active over a lifetime. So when people get into their 80s, even if they're healthy and they've done everything right, those valves are working hard and for a long period of time, and they eventually start to show their wear and tear and need to be replaced. And then the heart needs a lot more oxygen to do its job. The aging heart does. So we see people, getting, again, short of breath a little easier than they did when they were younger. So the next video talks about blood vessels, and we will pick up with that in the next video.